Okay, so I thought we'd start out if you could just introduce yourself for those who are unfamiliar with your work. What was your journey like becoming a hypertrophy coach, and what made you want to do this for a career?
Well, that's not how it really unfolded for me. I started lifting when I was 14, and I didn't want to start lifting then. I was actually living out in Albany, Oregon, with my martial arts instructor's parents at the time, and he forced me to go to the gym, and I hated it. And then eventually, I saw the results happen uh, with my body, and I was pretty much instantly addicted once I saw that happen. And my early love was bodybuilding. I was a huge Dorian Yates and Mike Mincer guy. I really gravitated towards, still to this day, I consider that, but at that time was more of the thinking man's approach to training rather than just going in and doing a bunch of stuff haphazardly and a ton of volume and all that kind of stuff. There was the approach of going in, um, hammering some movements really hard, progressive overload, being smart about the movements that you pick. Of course, it's been refined over the last few decades to a little bit better degree, but to me, that was what I really gravitated to early on. And then after enough years of lifting, probably I don't know how many, I got off into powerlifting and gravitated away from more bodybuilding and hypertrophy style stuff and focus on the big three. And I did that for like a decade. I didn't do a ton of meets, maybe half a dozen back when people used to do meets all the time. But I had a family then at the time, trying to travel around and do various meets all over the place. I worked full time and had a family and stuff like that. But I competed over the course of about 10 years and wasn't great at it. I was I was really strong at overhead pressing. And the overhead press is not one of the power lifts. I had an almost 405 strict overhead press. I did 385.
That's
And then
crazy.
yeah, and my 365 for a double is still out on YouTube. So there's a video out there of it. So, and then I think by the time I retired. I think it's actually quitting when you stop doing something you're not very good at. But I think by the time I quit powerlifting, I lift for I had like a 725 deadlift and a 45 bench, and my incline and bench were actually very similar. My incline was like 475. I had very strong shoulders, clearly. And so I got done with all that at about when I was about 40, and then I'd already decided years before that I knew when I turned 40 I wanted to get in shape, take care of myself, get away from doing the big three and all that shit. And that's what I did. And so I got back into focusing on my love, just like bodybuilding and training for growing muscle, and really hated the fact that I lost those 10 years doing crappy powerlifting. And
That's
so
interesting.
that's kind of,
Oh, sorry to cut you off. What made you want to go into powerlifting from
you know,
bodybuilding?
when one of the things at that time, and I don't feel this way anymore, but I felt like that, and it still is, bodybuilding is a very subjective sport. And whereas powerlifting, I felt like was less subjective. Here's your lifts, you get judged on your lifts. And, I mean, you could say powerlifting is even technically subjective, depending on how, with all the talk about high squats. It's really weird. I've been away from that whole world of powerlifting so long now, and I watch guys fight online with each other like little kids about if a squat was high. I'm like, wow, did I used to really be involved in that crap? So it's just really kind of funny to watch all of that unfold, and then guys getting their whole sense of like self and their identity wrapped up in what their total is, or whoever's got a bigger whatever.
Mhm.
And we're not even talking about penises, but just all that. It was hard to believe. I think it's such a low rent mentality when you end up finding your self-worth in the amount of pounds on a bar, right? Like there's life is has such a bigger picture to it than that. So, but I got pulled into that too. So when like I said, when I retired, I went back to my first love, and it was so nice, like to be able to go to the gym use all the various machines and get back to training in a completely different style and not have to squat or bench or deadlift every week and be, kind of like wrapped into barbell lifts that end up really beating you up over time. And I've honestly, I ended up with what's funny of all things, I tore my pec after I retired from powerlifting. I never tore a pec. Got away with all those years and never had a problem. And I tore my pec doing dips, and I never really recovered from like a full strength perspective, but I didn't really care. But yeah, that was the evolution of getting back over into doing more hypertrophy stuff. And I worked with Charles Poliquin. At the time, there was a multitude of other guys I ended up working with over the years to look into more like functional anatomy and biomechanics and stuff like that. So it's been a much more fun evolution of what I've been interested in over the past 6 years than powerlifting really ever was for me. And then that's how I ended up creating more of the business approach was through powerlifting at the time. And just doing literally training books and programs for people and clients. And I trained at the time, I trained Pete Rubish. I don't know which side of the spectrum you're involved in, if it's more like just lifting in general, or if it's strength or like
health and fitness in general. I'm more into bodybuilding style training.
Okay, cool.
I could give like right now I could give a shit about powerlifting, to be honest.
Okay, this would be a good podcast. So yes, at the time I actually trained Pete Rubish at that time to his best total. I worked with some equip lifters and got them elite totals and stuff like that. And that was kind of the business model. But what I do now is like 1,000 times more fulfilling. And I don't think the cool thing about like bodybuilding or just health and fitness in general is that when you really get in shape, you're doing your conditioning and your cardio and your diet's on point, and you're lifting is good. You feel good. Your body feels good. You feel good in your own skin. Training is fun. Motivation is high. And somebody could say that about powerlifting too. But to me, there's a really stark difference in how I feel mentally and physically about training and all this stuff now and then over the past many years than how I did those years I was powerlifting. And even in contrast, in the first couple of decades when I was training, when I was doing more bodybuilding style stuff, I just loved it so much more.
Mm-hmm. I like how you referred to bodybuilding as a more subjective sport. It's more based on aesthetics. It's more of an art, while powerlifting is, if you're not hitting your numbers, then you're not going to excel.
Yeah, and I think the word I was looking for before was like tangible, right? Like powerlifting is supposed to be more tangible, where it's like you do a lift and you do it to a certain standard, and then that standard is good. But then, there's all sorts of stuff that becomes subjective within those quote unquote standards too. So yeah, I would say it is a little more tangible, but definitely, even in bodybuilding, if you know what you're looking at, if you have like a trained eye, understand aesthetics and symmetry and balance and separation and conditioning and all that stuff, it's a little bit it's less subjective than a lot of people think it is too. Because generally, I can walk to a bodybuilding show, and as soon as the guys walk out, I don't really miss them. Hey, who's got this show? Or I'm gonna at least pick out your top 2 guys every time.
Yeah, that's totally fair. As far as education, where did you learn everything you know? Was it mostly self-taught, or did you get a bunch of certifications, degrees, or anything like that?
No, I don't have any certifications or anything. I get that question a lot. I really have worked with a lot of really good people over the years. Mostly I'm self-taught, especially the first couple of decades was all articles, books, stuff like that. Yeah. And then over the last at least 10 years, working with everyone from Charles Poliquin to John Meadows to Cassim Hansen, to a multitude of different people, and just expanding that knowledge base. But I mean, I still literally spend hours a day, every day, going over studies and anatomy and biomechanics and all sorts of different things. So it's such a fun thing for me. I never get tired. So a lot of it is self-taught and just that kind of a never-ending thirst to just continue to grow your knowledge. And I think that that's how you're either going to be relevant or stay relevant and continuously give out good education and good training programs and stuff like that for people, is that you have to have that innate desire to want to continuously get better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So self-taught, mentorship. One thing in particular I was interested in is just learning how to interpret data, because someone like you could interpret, like, how do you learn to read studies and go through studies? Because it seems like a lot of people in the fitness industry will take a study and they'll kind of filter it through their ideology or how they view training, and they'll try to flip it to suit their opinions. How did you learn to go through data and be able to kind of weed through the bullshit?
I would just read the study.
Yeah, which most people don't, I guess.
I don't like, yeah, that's a big complaint through most of the evidence-based guys like Brad Schoenfeld or Alan Aragon, the guys I actually like respect, is that people continuously cite abstracts without taking time out to read how the study was done, the inclusion or exclusion criteria, and those kind of things. I spent tons of time, honestly, like reading stuff by everybody from Brad to Lyle McDonald to Alan. I actually even think like Lyle's like brilliant, but he's just so crazy. But like he has a way to break down studies and data. And if you go and look at his stuff, it'll give you an idea of how to go and read studies and look at that kind of stuff. So, I mean, basically the other guys, Chris Beardsley. I love Chris Beardsley. If there's any one person I could say, if there was a researcher that probably I feel like is the most like spot on with the way he looks at data or presents data, it's going to be Chris. I mean, he's just like a genius. And but coming back to that part is my idea was looking at data was, is this even real world applicable? Because people get in fights and arguments about what some data showed. And I'm like, why are you guys even arguing about this? Because like nobody's ever going to do this like in the real world. So who really cares about what the outcomes were? So kind of stuff that I would look at, all depending, you need context, were the subjects trained, and is the way they looked at like the methods they used to arrive at certain conclusions, is it even real world applicable? Because if it wasn't real world applicable, I really didn't care. So if you kind of ask yourself, I think that particular question, does this have a real world application from a training standpoint? Can somebody use it to get better results than what they're doing? If the answer is no, then that was kind of one of the methods I used. And then for a while, another guys that I was friends with and did work with was Scott Stevenson, who also looks at data a lot and stuff like that too. So I've always had other people that I could learn from. All of us should have somebody, or did have somebody, that we learned from over the years and got better from, as far as how they did things, or them sharing their own knowledge and that kind of stuff. So that was, I mean, basically just getting in. Because I've been self-taught and everything, I really like getting in and just figuring things out for myself.
When it comes to mentorship, was this in person at the time, or because a lot of people now in the digital age, we have a lot of digital mentors, people that we follow, people such as yourself that I would follow, learn from, but we never really meet the people. We're never really physically in contact with the people. For you, was it mostly people that, like, say John Meadows? Would you go to where he was at and work with them? What did that process look like exactly?
Yeah, over the years, I spent time with all these people. Charles Balaklund and I spent lots of time together. I spent lots of time with John Meadows. I've spent time with Scott Stevenson. I spent time with Cassim. So there's like a multitude of, I said, for I trained and stuff with Ben Bukolski and Joe Bennett. So it's just, yeah, over the years, I made an effort to get out there and actually spend time in person with someone and not just talking online with people. And I think that's a really valuable thing. If they really do want to get better, I think that's an unbeatable way to get up to do that, to really grow, to spend your money, spend your time, and get out and go and work with people in person.
Mm-hmm. You know, you put some skin in the game. You got to pay for your plane ticket. You got to
Yeah.
take time off from whatever you're doing to make money, for sure. That's awesome.
Yeah. So that was always my thought process. I don't know how many expos I went to over the years trying to network and make connections and stuff like that. So if somebody doesn't really want to do that, then they're, I don't know how serious they are about actually growing either in a business or on their own knowledge or that kind of thing. I think it's vitally important for you to get out and make face-to-face connections and learn from people in person, because there's a ton of stuff that can get misconstrued over the internet. And there's just so much you're just going to get out of just conversations when you spend a whole day with somebody. So put in some real training time with them, put in a whole day of hanging out with them, getting to know them as people, getting to know their ideologies about training, nutrition, and all that kind of stuff. And that's where I think that's a huge part of where you're going to build a big portion of your knowledge base.
Mm-hmm. And do you feel like there's a strong sense of community in the fitness industry, or do you think it's pretty, do you think it's divisive? Do you think there's ideological warfare when it comes to certain ideas that makes people, like, would you say that the fitness industry as a whole is kind of a toxic environment, or is it pretty friendly and easy to network?
I would think that all depends on individuals. I think some people can be, it could be toxic or bring a certain amount of dysfunctional attributes to the table. But even with and I bring this up, even with the evidence-based community who likes to tout themselves on being all sciencey, I see a lot of cognitive bias out of the evidence-based community.
I actually had that written down for later in the podcast. It's interesting because you see there's the quacks on one end of the spectrum that are just saying things completely not based in reality or data. And then you have the science-based community that also has their dogmas.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things, and I don't for example, I see a lot of stuff put out by Renaissance Periodization where they absolutely ignore the data that we're looking at, but because they have a particular training ideology that they have to continuously double down on, they will actually ignore certain literally scientific facets that keep coming up. But because they built a gigantic business off of those training methodologies, they're going to double down on those training methodologies. And what real science does is continuously questions, what's the reason for this, or what are the outcomes going to be when we do things a certain way. It is always it should be this continuous quest to get better information, more complete information. Mm-hmm. And that's not really, they love to call themselves sciencey or, evidence-based, but there's definitely a lot of bias that you can see now even going on the, people and companies or whatever that consider themselves scientific or evidence-based.
No, yeah, I've seen that a ton. And that's another, like we were saying before, people just filter everything through their ideological, their beliefs. And they just misconstrued things.
Right. Even the same thing with nutrition. I see that. I think that there's guys that call themselves evidence-based that still just, stand up and are still shouting about, calories in, calories out, when a really more evidence-based nutritional approach is going to be more robust than just calories in and calories out.
That stuff drives me crazy because yes, there's truth to that, but there's more to the puzzle than that.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. If you just want to lose weight, all that matters is calories in, calories out. But most people who are lifting weights and trying to improve body composition or performance, they want to do more than just lose weight.
They want to be
right?
healthier.
Well, not only that, but you'd want to have higher degrees of muscle retention, lower degrees of body fat. You want to be making sure that you have the least amount of micronutrient deficiency, so forth and so on. So I think there's a bigger picture than just saying calories in, calories out over and over again. I think that's intellectual laziness.
Mm-hmm. That's one thing that I haven't read a lot about is your philosophy on nutrition. There's the keto camp, the low carb camp. That's the big thing. That's been the big thing for the last few years. And you have
keto's I think keto was hot, like really hot a couple of years ago.
Yeah, it's starting to kind of, yeah.
Yeah, it's cooling off a little bit. Thank goodness, because it brought about some pretty rough ideologies with it by some dogmatic people. Mm-hmm. So keto's, I think, dying off a little bit. And I think if you wanted to ask me, like from a high level overview, my nutritional approach would be that you want to make sure that you understand your caloric intake needs and that you're prioritizing protein. So I think to me, it's calories and protein together. So you can't separate those, because in the meta-analysis, where we look across all dietary approaches, when calories and protein are equated for, then they all work almost exactly the same. So that means from there, it's just sorting out, if we're looking at like a fat loss perspective, you're just sorting out getting your calorie intake dialed in along with your protein intake. And I'm slightly lazy about that. I think you just do protein intake as 1 gram per pound of body weight. And just to keep it simple. And people, wow, they overthink protein intake. It's like so bad how much they overthink it.
They
so
overthink
do you
everything.
really think something magical is going to happen between like 200 grams of protein and 225 grams of protein? Probably not. So just kind of get in that ballpark of 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight. Mm-hmm. And I don't even do the fat-free mass, the lean mass. I'm like, I'm not going to go get a DEXA scan to figure out how much fucking protein I'm supposed to be eating each day. That's really dumb. So protein, calories, and then manage your carbs and your fats. Fill out the rest of those calories that are left over from there, and whatever way that you want to fill those in. There's a multitude of other facets about that. For example, picking foods that have that are high on the satiety index or lower on the satiety index, making sure to avoid trigger foods or highly processed foods and things like that. I don't ascribe to the camp who says stuff like there's no such thing as good foods or bad foods. I do think, I don't know if there's good and bad foods, but I think there's foods that are inherently better choices than others. Maybe that's a better way.
Yeah, I actually posted something on that. People saying there's no such thing as good foods, or there's food doesn't have a moral value. It's like, no shit. We're not talking about the moral value.
Well, I mean, that depends. Do you have a severe food allergy that could put you in the hospital? Because I would consider that to be a bad food for you. Yeah. So, like from an N equals 1, personal individual perspective, yes, there would be good foods or bad foods. If you're trying to have a high degree of adherence to a diet, then a food that causes a trigger response in you, where you go off the rails and start binging, I would consider that to be a bad food, since it causes a reaction in you that's counter to the goals that you have in mind. Mm-hmm. So I would consider that quote unquote a bad food. I agree. It doesn't mean that this food is going to send you to hell. No. But if you have a particular goal in mind, so yeah, the moral value of food. If you have a particular goal in mind, I think there's foods that will fall under these foods are counterproductive to meeting my goals. And these foods are far better choices in terms of helping me attain those goals. So if you don't care about that shit, there's no such thing as good and bad foods. So it really it needs context. But to say there's no such thing as good and bad foods, I think needs context.
There's not enough conversations with nuance. It's just extremes on both ends. You know, there's people saying don't eat fruit, it's going to make you fat. And then there's people, you know, I don't know. There's just
No, that's true. Like there's people out there that are like, fruit has sugar in it and sugar makes you fat. And I'm
like,
like, that's
fuck's
really
sakes.
dumb too. That's really dumb too, right? Like
Yeah.
I think there's actually, it's the whole causation equals correlation thing. And you can do that with a multitude of things in this world. And one that I always go back to, and you can Google this, is I believe it's like um, the amount of lemons that are imported into the United States have a direct correlation with the amount of fatal car accidents that happen or something. You
Yeah.
can literally Google
Yeah.
that whole thing and you'll find that there's like, so, but just because that happens doesn't mean people are dying in car accidents because there's more lemons being imported. So,
Absolutely.
and it's literally something like more the more lemons that are imported from like Mexico or something. It's really weird, but if you look it up, you'll see there's a literally a long correlation that they lined up with. Here's an exact graph when this happens, but clearly they don't have anything to do with one another. So, I don't even know how I got off on that tangent, but I
No, no,
always like,
I totally see what you're saying there. Um, what do you think of the whole anti-diet culture, body positivity movement? Because that's something where, you know, yeah, I'm gonna get into we're gonna get into trouble here right away, get
yeah, I've
canceled.
never shied away from trouble before though.
No, it's all good. My thing is, you see people who are being very dogmatic about dieting, which is super annoying. You know, keto zealots, vegan zealots. It's
Right,
super fucking annoying. But then you have these people who have taken that to the full other side of the spectrum.
right.
So
We'll get some light going in here.
yeah, no worries.
So I there's no such thing. That light is really weird like that. Okay. So let me do this.
Yeah, take your time.
See if that's better. I just want to. It's starting to get dark here.
Yeah, my lighting isn't the best either.
Okay.
Not a big deal. Don't worry about it.
So I've actually read a multitude of articles. There's no such thing as the whole healthy at every size. So there's literally, I think there's a meta-analysis out there on it now that shows that even if if you're overweight, even if your blood work is good right now and you don't have current health problems and nothing is showing up in the way of, you know, heart problems, say like a calcium score, you know, or your triglycerides or your cholesterol, that I think there's some longitudinal data that consistently backs up that if you're overweight, even I think as by as much as or as little as like 10 pounds or 15 pounds, that the degree of health decline that you're going to have is infinitely higher than somebody who's going to be at a healthy body weight. And then people say stuff like, well, what's a healthy body weight? Because those BMI calculators are bullshit, whatever. They're actually not that far off.
No.
People get mad about that. I'm not saying they're super accurate. They're based on like a general population thing. People who don't lift and just walking around, and somebody say, well, if I was that size, I'd be a beanpole or whatever. But there's also a higher degree of health that's continuously correlated with lower body weights and more caloric intake. So if you're talking about health optimization, you can't defend or ascribe to the healthy at any size. Like you just can't. It's mind-boggling to me because there's an absolute in there. So healthy at any size, like that's an absolute, any size, like healthy at any size, It doesn't matter how big
1,000
you are.
pounds.
Like,
Yeah.
if you're 1,000 pounds, like right, if you're 1,000 pounds, you could be as healthy as somebody who's 6 foot tall and 185.
Mhm.
No, that's just a number. Like you can't be.
Yeah.
So no, clearly I do not, and I know there's some staunch defendants of the healthy at any size movement, and I'm definitely not one of them.
Yeah. It's just more the woke ideology that has infected modern society. They're just
Yeah.
taking things way too extreme. I feel like I owe you a thank you because after I discovered your work and I started applying some of the concepts, such as even something as simple as not retracting my scapula when I'm pressing, because that was something I was taught, and that's something that's floating around. Even when I'm doing a lat pull down, I used to retract and then do the pull, which is so stupid now that I understand proper scapular mechanics. And just letting that full stretch happen and just letting my scapula do its thing has like done wonders.
Do its thing, right?
Dude, my
I don't know
shoulder.
why. I don't know why scapular manipulation became such a thing over the years, but it really did. Right from benching to pulling to rowing, was just not allowing your body to move naturally, and this idea that it was better to go into retraction and jam that loading right into
What was
the
that? What was that based on?
I think that some of it did come out of MI40.
I
The scapular retraction for benching stuff, that's been around in powerlifting as far back as I can remember. All of it, if you look at the way the body works and you look at real functional anatomy, it's not really that hard to decipher that, okay, we shouldn't be doing this. But you still have people preaching that. You still have people telling you that, okay, scapular retraction and benching is a more stable environment, when actually it's a less stable environment. The shoulder mechanics, it's not respecting the proper mechanics of the shoulder that is supposed to happen when you go into retraction. You want basically for the scapula to be able to rotate around the rib cage properly, so when you go into retraction and you allow the rhomboids and the traps pull the scapula into the rib cage, so it pulls down tight into the rib cage, and then when you press and then you allow a natural amount of protractions that's congruent with how the humerus is moving, then what happens is the anterior serratus actually pulls the scapula in and allows it to stay tight into the rib cage on the concentric portion.
And if you're constantly pressing with your scapula retracted, your serratus isn't going to do much.
Well, you're telling your body that there's no reason to even have it, because you down regulate both the anterior serratus and the pec's ability to produce force, because you're, by holding that back there and not allowing the pecs to shorten the way they want to shorten as they're basically trying to perform horizontal humeral adduction. You're basically down regulating the pec's ability to maximally produce force, which doesn't seem like a great idea if you're trying to press some heavy weights.
Yeah. The interesting thing about that too is I used to do these, like a couple of years ago, I was doing Scapula Push-Ups. You just keep your arms straight and you just press like this.
Right.
And then I thought to myself, and even in retraction, where you practice the retraction of your scapula. And then I thought to myself, I did think this to myself before I stumbled on your work. Why are we not just training that in the actual movement? Like if I'm doing a push-up, why am I not just protracting and letting my scapula work rather than having to do this goofy corrective exercise?
Where you actually, you're trying to compartmentalize off the movements and make the body work in sections.
That's a lot of the corrective, because I had a lot of pain. And so I was trying to do all these corrective exercises, and I don't do any corrective exercises anymore. Because I don't,
that's because if you actually do the movements correctly, they're corrective within themselves.
Yeah, I heard you say that.
Yeah, they're corrective within themselves. Think about it, it's crazy. If you allow the body to actually move the way it's designed, as long as you have a stable environment for it to produce force in, then you can do that. You don't end up with a bunch of things hurting. But when you're trying to do one thing, but you're telling the nervous system not to do the thing you're actually trying to do, then when you down regulate certain muscles' ability to stabilize the joint or produce force or whatever, then something else has to compensate for that, right? So you either end up with dysfunctional patterns in the joint, terrible motor patterns. You have weaknesses that consistently have to be covered up by other muscles to compensate for the fact that those muscles you haven't trained them to actually do their job and stuff like that. And then people wonder why they hurt.
Yeah. And then you have those people who spend 45 minutes in the gym before they work out because they're foam rolling and doing all types of.
Yeah, I walk in and go to the first exercise I'm doing and start my warm-up sets, and that's it. I don't have to do
Yeah,
any of that.
I still do a little bit of dynamic, but the more I listen to you and the more I listen to some other people, yeah, just going through the movements and just warming up, gradually putting the weight up.
Yeah, it's
You know?
like activation exercises. I'm like, why don't you just pick movements that are good and just do
Yeah,
good movements?
I get that. Psychologically, I like to just like even just do like a couple seconds of arm swings and stuff like that. I feel like,
Yeah, like if you're just like just doing a general body warm up, like that's totally fine. I think
yeah,
I mean more for like that's like it's definitely a woman thing with the whole like for example glute activation work. I'm like you
yeah,
don't need glute act if you actually go and look at the research, the movements that are consistently used in quote unquote glute activation are step ups, which are just a great box step ups, which is just a great glute
great
movement.
glute
Like
exercise.
yeah, so the glute medius is doing stabilization, and the glute maximus is doing the dynamic portion of going into hip extension. So I'm like, okay, so if you're just doing step ups, that's like a box step up. That's just a good glute movement. That's not a activation exercise. But if you
Mm.
look literally at the data, when they look at glute activation, I think the box step up is actually number one. So when they talk about activation, I'm like, well, that's just a good glute movement.
Glute exercise. Yeah.
It's just a glute exercise.
Like people who put a band on their knees and then walk side to side. It's
Yeah, I'm like, okay, it's great performance work. But you're not doing
no.
anything for your glutes right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, I just kind of go through a quick little, like I'm warmed up and ready to go in 3 minutes. Just some arm circles, quick dynamic moves. I think it's more of like more of a psychological thing for me at this point, just to feel like I'm.
And placebo is a real thing. I think
Yeah.
where we have a problem is where when people actually think they're doing something from a they're doing something from a mechanical perspective that actually doesn't have merit, that they're wasting their time. And walking in, doing some stuff to get warmed up over the course of 3 to 5 minutes, not a big deal.
Yeah. And then how do you feel about stretching and stuff like that?
I did because I did martial arts for a lot of years. I did a lot of stretching, but I just loaded stretching has been shown to add more mechanical tension to a training session. So like Dante Trudell kind of had that right, the way he set that up for those early dog crap cycles where you would train the muscle and then add in loaded stretching for a certain period of time. And that is definitely a way to accumulate more mechanical tension.
So what do you mean by, do you mean say you're doing leg press, you finish your last set, you still have a burn in the quads, then you go down into the bottom of a sissy squat and just hold that stretch?
Well, I mean, you rest. I mean, you do the leg press to failure, and then you rest 3 to 5 minutes, and then yeah, you go to the bottom of a sissy squat, and yeah, and you load the. It's a loaded stretch for the quads, and there's basically it's an increase in passive tension, because of the passive forces that are in the muscle fiber. So there's active mechanical tension, and there's active forces and passive forces. So there's an increase in the passive forces in the muscle fibers, but it does accumulate more mechanical tension within the training session.
Yeah, that all makes sense. One of the first posts I saw from you that caught my attention, it was I believe it was a tweet that you posted on your Instagram. I actually have it here right now. It's hard pills for some fitness people to swallow. Squats and deadlifts aren't for everyone. There's no must-do exercises. Big compound movements aren't that great for hypertrophy training. Maximal strength training and hypertrophy training are two very different things. When I first read that, just where I was I was like, whoa, that's kind of jarring, because that was controversial to me when I read that.
That's so weird because like
it's
when
stupid.
you read it out to me, I'm like, okay, yeah.
Oh yeah, for sure. But
It's
just where I was at and the people I was hanging around, the people I was training with, the bros that are married to the barbell movements, the barbell bench, back squats, conventional deadlifts, this is sacrilegious to them.
Right, of course.
And because even just reading people online, the first people I stumbled on, that was the meat and potatoes of the training, was the compound barbell lifts.
Right.
But when I did read that, I was secretly happy because I I felt burnt out. I felt like I was married to these barbell lifts and I wasn't getting any results. All I was getting, they didn't make me feel good. I felt burnt out. And I would just be so meticulous. I'm watching Squat University and these people that are form Nazis. And I knew I was squatting properly. I knew I was deadlifting properly, but I just never felt good with the movements. That could be my structure. That could be a lot of things. For those who haven't read your writing on the subject, could you elaborate on why the barbell compounds may be poor choices for hypertrophy?
Yeah, I mean, number one, locking your joints into very specific patterns, right? Most, for example, like great one is like for your pecs, right? Like if you want to train your pecs, it generally requires a lot of arcing motions. You can't, like, even if you're doing an incline press and you have your arm path lined up correctly, you can't get humeral adduction because your arms are locked into the barbell. Some humeral adduction, right? They come across the body, right? So as the pecs shorten, as you're pressing, your arms stay out here. So like, for example, an incline press like that will load the distal fibers because it's the loading is the resistance profile is descending essentially. So it's really heavy at the bottom and it gets easier as you press it, or bell curve, bell curve if you want to be more specific, but it's heavy at the bottom, a little easier or a little harder, like right there in the middle, and then easiest at the top. So you're dealing with a resistance profile where, for the most part, it's really just heaviest at the bottom. And then everything else, I mean, you do with a barbell for the most part is locking your joints into very specific positions. And that may not be the positions there where they actually want to move naturally as the muscle shortens and lengthens. So that's a lot of what people find, and that happens is that the tension gets dispersed across a lot of the passive and connective tissue, and that's why a lot of people end up feeling beat up barbell lifts over time. So the other one is just the fact that I'm trying to think. I just wrote a whole article on discussing these. I mean, that's probably one of the biggest ones. You see, you're number one, you're dealing with limited resistance profiles. And it's just hard to beat using cables, dumbbells, and really good, well-designed machines that allow you to move through what I would consider a better range of motion for whatever muscles that you're trying to train. So anybody that wants to get a more kind of in-depth view of that, I did an article for Chess Magazine where I talked about why barbells aren't really that great for building muscle. So there's actually, let me see what I have to, because I'm just drawing a blank here. And I'm not sure why.
I actually saw that article, but I couldn't go back and find it.
Yeah, I got it right here. Yeah, the one's the resistance profiles. For example, that's what I was talking about. For like, if you're doing backward, let's say you're doing a barbell row. Barbell row is another one because all the guys like the proper barbell rows.
I despise barbell rows.
Yeah, it's a big, heavy compound, but you're locked into a pronated wrist position where when you're actually pulling to you, you can get much better mechanics at the shoulder and in retraction and stuff like that if you tend to be in a more neutral grip, especially for the upper back stuff. If you want to do, hold on, how do I get you back? There we go. If you want to do, say, more rhomboid work, yeah, then a more pronated grip can be okay. But a barbell row, for example, puts you in a degree of hip flexion, loads the erectors highly. You have a long moment arm from literally to the hips to the load. So there's a lot of low back work stability that's got to be done. That was the other barbells tend to require a lot of internal stability. So one of the things that are good hypertrophy movements that we see is we want to have a high degree of bracing and stability in the movement, but we want that to come from the external means. So the more bracing and stability there is in a movement, the more force production we're going to get out of the tissue that we're training, because there's less activity by the antagonist muscles involved in that. So when there's a higher degree of antagonist muscles in a movement, then there's a down regulation in the agonist movements that are actually trying to do the load. So when you have barbell movements, because there's a high degree of stability involved, a lot of the energy that you end up using in a barbell movement is literally just going to stabilize against the barbell load. So if you're doing a barbell row, for example, a lot of people think barbell rows are some great back exercise. They're not terrible, but they're not great. They 100% are not great. They would be pretty close to terrible, but you're in a degree of hip flexion, you're loading the lower back really hard, and it's got a terrible resistance profile. So a barbell row is going to get heavier as you row it, because the muscles shorten. So in a more ideal situation, for example, when you're doing a back movement, a lat movement, or upper back movement, you would want to see a descending resistance profile. So as the muscles shorten and can produce less force, you would want that load to drop off. So that way the load isn't the heaviest where you're actually weakest. That's the opposite of what we want.
Mm-hmm.
And most barbell movements are pretty good at doing that, giving us crappy resistance profile. So I think that was a lot of ones I covered. Just locking your joints in, it tends to beat you up over time. Poor resistance profiles. They require a high degree of stability and bracing by you internally, mm-hmm. So you're going to get less output. And then the other reason, and I don't cover this one a lot, but something a lot of people don't think about is you don't want to spread out your tension to a whole bunch of different muscles. So if I want to grow my pecs, then why would I want to spread out all that mechanical tension to the delts and triceps and all these other various places? Wouldn't it be better to just mechanically load the pec fibers that I'm trying to grow? Mm-hmm. So what about for delts? If I just want to grow my delts, a lot of guys like the standing overhead press is a terrible delt exercise, right? It requires a high degree of stability. So yeah. You got to stabilize with the low back. Basically what you're really training when you do, like, for example, a standing press, you have the distribution of that tension gets spread across the low back, the mid back, the upper back, delt, arms, some of the clavicular pecs. So you're pressing from that standing position, and what you're really training is that upward rotation and elevation of the scapula. So, but then you spread the tension out to a multitude of other muscles that have to do stabilizing too. So if you're trying to train the anterior delts, for example, why wouldn't you just use a high incline and line up the resistance with those anterior delt fibers and then mm-hmm. load those in that mid-range position? That's a much better option than trying to do a standing press.
I have a question about stability. So yeah. you want to use a movement that has stability, say the machine, use something sort of, let's take incline machine press. Right. The machine is stable. You're not doing any stabilization. Well, you are to a slight degree, but it's very low. Is stabilization so important to the point where you should always choose the most stable? You should always, is there any merit to working unstable loads or performing less stable exercises?
What you don't want, the better way to look at this is that you don't want stability to be a limiting factor.
Yes. Okay.
So maybe that's a better way to phrase it, is that you don't want to say the limiting factor in this exercise is stability. So I'll give you an example. In a front squat, what is the limiting factor is going to be your ability to stabilize that load with basically your rhomboids and your core, right? So so stability is the limiting factor in a front squat. Mm-hmm. Like, it's not your quads. No. If you just put the bar on your shoulders, right, you have more stability than you have in a front squat. And now you can squat more and actually load the quads more. And then I've heard other people try to make the claim that because of activation studies or whatever, but I don't believe that. I think that when you're having to brace more, um, you're having to brace more upright. So front squats are more core and rhomboid limited because of the bar position, whereas in a back squat, it's not. Like your rhomboids are never going to fail in holding the bar on a back squat, but in front squat they are. They sometimes like it pulls you over, right? You can't stay in that upright position. But from a hypertrophy standpoint, there's nothing where you let me work in an unstable environment that's going to be beneficial. Because as I said, as stability, or let's say instability, increases, you get higher degrees of input from the antagonist muscle, which is now trying to stabilize the joint. So if an antagonist muscle is more active, then automatically the agonist muscle is going to downregulate its force production. The other thing is that there's a higher degree of coordination that's going to be involved by the nervous system. So when the nervous system has a higher degree of coordination involved in the movement, it's also it's not going to send signals from the motor neurons to the motor units to, hey, activate more muscle fibers to reduce force, because they're just having to coordinate and stabilize the load.
Mm-hmm. So it doesn't, yeah, I like how you brought me clarity there, because you said incline. So say you're doing an incline bench press with dumbbells, although you still have to stabilize the load, stability is not going to be the limiting factor.
Right.
Right. Like it should be your muscles being the limiting factor. It's not
Right.
necessarily
There's
like,
more. Yeah. I mean, and you think about that, right? So there would still be more stability required in, say, an incline dumbbell press than a machine incline, well, let's say a hammer strength incline press, right?
yeah.
So there's more stability in a hammer strength incline press, so than an incline dumbbell press. They both are good options, but it all depends on what you're trying to get out of the movement. You have a limited resistance profile in an incline dumbbell press too. So overall, in that particular position, I would probably take a hammer strength incline press over an incline dumbbell press, but I use both.
Yeah.
So there's nothing wrong, say, with dumbbell movements for the chest, but just understand that there are still going to be limitations.
Limitations, yeah.
Yes, there's just limitations. So is another exercise that offers up a converging arm path for the pecs that has a higher degree of stability, is it going to be a better option than, say, an incline dumbbell press? Probably.
It's interesting because quite a few years ago, I fell into the whole functional training camp. And a lot of that is, a lot of those people in that camp are against machines. They say they're non-functional. Those are the same people that are, doing squats on Bosu balls and using a lot of kettlebells. And they think that if you are using too many machines, that there's not real world application to those movements, which is bullshit.
Was it that game, that guy's name, Naughty or whatever, from the functional, like where he's like literally like like he's bouncing on one leg, throwing a medicine ball like a trampoline and catching it or whatever.
Yeah.
I'm like, I don't know what environment that I'm doing that I've ever done that in my life. I don't understand how that's functional. But I played, I've got friends who do jujitsu, who just do bodybuilding, and they're amazing jujitsu guys.
Yeah.
And all the stuff they do in the gym seems to carry over into jujitsu pretty well. I've just always thought if you got stronger in the gym, even if it was on machines or whatever, if you have a stronger muscle and in real life, if you can apply that strength from those muscles and the stuff you're doing in real life, that was functional.
Absolutely. And to take it back to the barbell movements, I never got a lot of hypertrophy out of back squats. And as soon as I started doing leg press, which was something I didn't do often, what else was I doing? Walking lunges, leg extensions. I don't have a good hack squat machine at my bench, but I have done hack squats, and oh my God, the first time where I felt, it wasn't my nervous system giving out, it was my quads giving out. And it's such a different way of training, to the point where I had never really experienced, obviously you have DOMs and you experience tension in the muscle doing barbell movements, but nothing like leg press or even just
there was a study I saw a while back that affirmed another thing I told people, and it was that when you start incurring fatigue within a movement, you're going to be far more highly likely to compensate with non-fatigued muscles.
Yeah.
So let's say you're doing a squat, like a barbell squat, and you're trying to bias your quads, you're driving your knees forwards, and you start getting fatigued, and then what you start doing there in order to compensate for that fatigue is instead of driving your knees forwards and maximizing knee flexion, you actually start maximizing hip flexion. So now the quads are actually doing less work. And so somebody might say, well, now you're just squeezing more blah, blah, out of the quads. I'm like, no, actually what you're doing is you're continuing to build more nervous system fatigue, and you're creating more peripheral muscle damage, which is going to take you longer to recover from. Whereas if you just strap yourself into a leg press or a hack squat, you could just go to town on maximizing that knee flexion and destroying your quads. And it's not, you don't end up compensating with other muscle groups. And it's a much more ideal hypertrophy movement.
Not to mention the intensity that you can go. I never felt fully confident going to true failure doing a back squat. You can't really.
Well, you go like the form failure, right?
Form failure, because as soon as you start losing form, that's when the risk of injury, when you got a big barbell on your back, the risk of injury is quite intense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's
leg press.
Well, yeah, like I said, once you incur fatigue, you open up or poor or dysfunctional motor patterns, because your body at that point is just saying, hey, you're trying to move this load, and the muscles that you've been using, well, they run out of the ability to produce force. Let me get some other stuff involved. So yeah, that's why another reason why I'm not a fan of barbell movements as well is because of those compensating movement patterns. That's something I really did not address, but that ties in with the stability thing.
Absolutely.
So it requires more stability by you internally.
So another thing I wanted to get into, something else that was ingrained in my thinking, was the need to train body parts twice a week. And you seem to lean towards the once a week, keep your frequency down, intensity up, which I've started implementing, and it's been crazy. The amount of, you don't need a ton of volume when your sets are truly close to failure. Yeah. So if you could just go into that and discuss your thoughts on frequency and why the twice a week thing is.
I never bought into that, even when I think there was an early meta-analysis that Schoenfeld did, where he said that it looked like training a muscle twice a week had greater benefits than once a week. Because even when they did that meta-analysis, the results for twice a week wasn't really significantly better. And then they ended up doing a second one where they had a much more strict inclusion and exclusion criteria for the meta-analysis, and actually determined that, hey, look, when your volume is really close or equated for in the training week, training a muscle twice, that 2 or 3 times doesn't really do anything. So like the difference, there was no significant difference. So that just backed up what I felt like I'd already known anecdotally over the years was, hey, bro splits build a lot of muscle. You don't have to be enhanced, natural. I used bro splits my whole life, and I was natural for 20 years. So
you got really big as a natural.
I was almost 260 pounds. That's why it's funny, because I've been off like any androgen cycles for like 6 years, 7 years now. And people still accuse me of being on. And I'm like, bro, I was 290 pounds when I was on. Like,
how hard because once you come down to just HRT dose, how hard is it to keep the muscle on that you gain while cycling?
It's not at all. I talked with tons of guys that retired and they kept all that. It's like, once I dieted down, when I stepped on bodybuilding stage, I was 230 plus pounds, like in low single digit body fat. That's pretty big. So, and I still walk around like 240 and stay relatively lean all year. I think just once you built that base, and me and John Meadows talk about this all the time, once you built that base of mass from all the years of training, you don't need a lot of food. The important thing is just keep your training hard during the week. That causes that's that stimulus to keep that functional tissue, right?
That's
and
interesting.
So You don't need a bunch of drugs. You'll just pretty much keep what you got. Now, if I was doing like a gram of test and chunked in, like Tren, I never could use Tren. And people would still accuse me of using Tren. It was really weird. I used Tren one time for 8 days. I couldn't breathe. I was playing Xbox and I was breathing heavy playing Xbox. And I was like, this is not for me.
I don't get
And
a lot of people have an obsession with
I think the only steroid that all these little idiots online know is Tren.
I'm not really into the drugs. I'll look into it a
That's
little
what they
bit.
always say. I'm like, you guys do know there's tons of different kinds of like drugs out there to use. Tren's not everything. I never did use Tren. Like I said, used it 8 days. I used Tren Ace for 8 days and I didn't like it. But coming off the drugs, I felt so much better. That's another thing a lot of people don't realize. You feel so awful in those high doses.
Did you feel a dip at first though? Did you go
No,
down? Oh,
I
really? Did you
never
jump?
felt anything.
Did you jump?
No,
right
I
on
always got my
HRT?
blood work done, and I kept my test levels in the higher range of normal. So, and I worked with my HRT doc for that. So I never felt anything. I felt better.
Oh,
I felt
wow.
infinitely better. Once I came down off all the drugs, I felt so much better.
Mhm.
The higher doses make you feel like garbage. You're tired, you're lethargic, you're fatigued. Yeah, I
Really?
mean, everything is so bad.
You
And a
think?
lot of guys that are natural don't realize that. Like, if you're taking a bunch of drugs, you feel awful.
Mhm.
So, like, I can remember, like, in my powerlifting days when I'd be getting ready for meets and I would throw in orals, like, I would take Anadrol. And NPP was my androgen that I really liked. And I can remember I'd put 135 on. So you're gonna put a plate on, and then I walk around the squat rack and I put a plate on, and then I have to go sit down for 10 minutes because I'd
That's
be breathing
brutal.
so hard and the low back pumps would already be kicking in. So a lot of people that don't know about low back pumps, if anybody ever listens or watches this, they'll start laughing. Jim Wendler and I used to laugh about that all the time, about how bad the low back pumps get. They're debilitating, like debilitating.
Because of the drugs. They found,
Yeah,
huh?
yeah. Yeah, some people say that it's kidney stuff, and I don't believe that because it's literally in the muscle. It's this cell volumizing thing that because it only happened when I was throwing like NPP and stuff, and that's not liver or kidney. Was it liver? No, yeah, I would say like liver toxicity. Sorry, my drug lingo is so old because I just checked out all that stuff so long ago.
No,
That's how you know I'm not doing drugs anymore because I can't even. So it was liver. You say your liver toxicity would be high, but the low back pumps, you could literally feel it. My records would be rock freaking hard.
Mm.
I couldn't move. I'd have to sit in the car in the parking lot for like half an hour to calm
Seized
down.
up.
Dude, yeah, it'd be like if your records seized up. I can't. That's the only way I can explain it. But that would happen doing anything. So it was terrible.
When you talk about building base muscle, that would apply to naturals as well. If you're lifting for 15 years, 20 years as a natural, that muscle is not just going to go away overnight. You know?
No, I mean that was the thing. I was 256 pounds as a natural. And I posted that picture. People freak out about that. I'm like, that was 100% natty. I'd never taken anything. I'd never even taken pro hormones. That was just food and training.
And you look crazy big in that.
Yeah, I was though. Like people thought I was on drugs then, and I was like, I would always think, bro, like I didn't know anything about drugs, nothing.
And
And
how many years was that? 10 years of training?
that was when I had just started. That was a full year into doing dog crap training. So that would have been in around what would that have been? Like 2003 or 4. So I'd been training I started training in 1989. So 99, so more like 13 to 15 years in.
Damn.
So that wasn't like new gains either, right? Like that was still growing into that. So when I see these guys online that argue with me that I can't tell if I've ever picked up a weight, and they're always like throwing out the drug stuff, I'm like, bro, I was almost 260 pounds.
I hate the accusations. Everyone's trying to
It's
figure
so
out.
bad. I'm like,
Everyone's trying to figure who gives a shit. First off, it doesn't discredit someone.
they usually try to come back to the whole, well, I just want to know what a guy's taking, if he's selling programs, whatever. I'm like, But if you saw that picture of me now, like here's my bulking cycle, you would think I was on stuff.
Yeah.
But I wasn't. I was like literally, I had never taken a thing, 100% just food and training. And so I think guys nowadays have a very lazy mentality. I don't think they understand what the hard work is. I don't think they understand what like power shoveling food for months on end is.
Mhm.
I don't think they understand those concepts.
I
And
have
so
a
now they see like I can walk around in decent shape at 240 pounds pretty much all year. Um, they're like, oh, like you big roid head or whatever. The trolls can't ever figure out if I either have, they want to tell me that I have like 14-inch arms and nothing this and nothing that, or if I'm just on a bunch of juice. Like it doesn't make sense to me. It's like, which one is it? Just pick one. Tell me I'm either really small, tiny, have like asparagus arms and like no legs or whatever you want to say, or just tell me I'm a big roid head still. Like just figure one out though, troll. Like don't do both. You can't have both. You don't get to insult me and say I'm really small and I'm this, but then also accuse me of just being on a bunch of drugs. Like, which one is it? Either like I'm on a bunch of drugs, and dude, you're really jealous because you think I'm super jacked, or you're like I'm nothing. So just say that. So just pick a side. Like insult me from one side or the other. You don't get to insult me from both sides of the aisle. You got to pick an aisle side.
That's funny.
So I think that's my message to natural guys, and that's why I think people like you can't talk. I'm like I am probably more qualified to talk to natural guys than most of those guys out there that claiming to be natty, because I've always been open about when I was using drugs, when I came off drugs.
That is very important. What would you say? Just being open and genuine about it, because people,
yeah,
there's so much bullshit out there. It's like just do it. No one cares.
When I was taking drugs, I was open about it. I've been open since I come off. Guys will say stuff like, "I believe you're." I'm like, dude, I've always like. You can go back to my blog. You can go to all these places and see where I talked about
Yeah.
what I've never hidden that stuff. I remember there was a world record holder power lifter. I didn't take a whole lot, not compared to what most guys would take.
Yeah.
But he told me, he told me because he knew what I was taking. He said, there's no trophy for highest total with lowest dose. So like that's the mentality about that. But like I said, I feel like that I have a great platform to talk to people about all that stuff. So when I was 20 years natural, like really, I wasn't fake natty. I was real natty.
Yeah.
And then I was on for like heavy cycles for like 6 years. And then I've been off for, there you go, like 7 years. So
most people want to use it as an excuse. They think that you have to do drugs to get big. You know, if they're
right.
not.
Or the other one I see is guys who are, it's two sides of it. Either it's the guys that think that everybody's on something that's either lean or big or whatever, or it's the guys who actually believe the guys that say they're natty but are clearly not natty, and they'll say, if you train for a really long time, you can, like, dude, if you're shredded, here's the combination. If you're shredded and big, you're probably not natty.
Yeah.
There are some guys who can do it. But think about this. When you think about natty, the most genetically elite natty guy ever was Ronnie Coleman. He turned pro natural. He was 215 pounds in contest shape, shredded.
Yeah, I should look at
That's
those pictures again.
huge for a natural guy. That is gigantic. People don't get that. Anything over 200 pounds in the low single digit body fat is like, it's the 1% of 1% guys.
Mm-hmm.
And so Ronnie Coleman I think he was close to, maybe he was 220. He was huge but he was the most genetically elite guy ever. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're really huge and you're really shredded, you're probably not natty.
Fair enough. And for someone who is natural, and for those first 13 years that you were training as natural, or however many years, were you constantly shoveling back food? You were pretty much on a bulk for a decade.
No, I had periods where I got really lean. I would come down and I would get lean. I couldn't do that like forever. There were definitely times where I got leaner. When I was going to go back into the military after 9/11, in special operations, I had a complete paradigm shift in all my training, and I became more endurance focused. And I got down to about 200 pounds. And I was very, very lean at 200 pounds. I was probably 7 to 9% body fat at 200,
And
205.
did you keep a lot of muscle on the frame at that time?
Yeah, it was a long diet over the course of months and months and months, just bringing that down. But I've always retained mass pretty well. So I was probably 202 to 205, low single digit body fat. So I was a pretty big natural guy.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I do think though, I think there's something to be said for this. If you're a young guy and you're trying to get as big as possible, I really think staying completely natural for your first 8 to 10 years and just getting as power shoveling food for those first 8 to 10 years and getting as strong as possible in those optimal hypertrophy rep ranges, 8, 10, 12 reps. And that's it. That's your whole focus. And I will say that, here's the thing. To me, when I say that, that's the most simple thing in the world. Like, so in your first 8 to 10 years, eat as much food as you can. Don't worry about your body fat, and then just get really strong in that 8 to 12 rep range. I will still get 50 questions from dudes about this or this nuance or that nuance. And I'm like, dude, I cannot simplify this anymore for you.
Shut up and do the work.
Seriously, dude, I will say that like a story, and I will get guys with so many questions. I'm like, dude, this is why none of you fuckers ever get bigger or get better or grow. Because you get paralysis by analysis and you complicate every facet of this. What did I say? If you're a young dude and you're in your teens, early 20s, next 8 to 10 years, eat all the food you can eat. It's a constant, it's a power bulk for the next almost decade. And just try to get as strong as humanly possible in that 8, 10, 12 rep range. Yeah. I don't care how you do this. Say, well, should I do this? Bro, I just told you. Yeah. So they're like, I get this one question like, training 4 days a week, should I use a push-pull leg or upper lower? Dude, I don't care.
Doesn't matter.
It doesn't fucking matter. It drives me insane. Like, dude, it doesn't fucking matter.
What protein should I use?
Dude, it's like out deciding that you know for a fact that you have to buy a truck because of your job or something. And you're like, somebody's like, should I get a truck that has these rims or that rims on it? And I'm like, if you're talking about a functional truck, it doesn't matter. And then some asshole will hear this and be like, well, it could be, okay, never. That's why you guys don't get better. Absolutely. You get hung up they major in the minors. Mm-hmm. They constantly are majoring in the minors. They're trying to worry too much about the details that don't mean a whole lot in the big picture.
Well, it's just people avoiding work. That's all it is.
That too. I always loved the work. To me, that was the best part, was the work.
I love putting in the work, and even putting in the work of learning things, putting in the work of acquiring knowledge. I love that. I love reading books and podcasts and listening to these people.
I don't think it's coincidence that during the years that I was coming up, we didn't have the internet, and you just had to read books, read magazines, and then you read it and you're like, okay, I got to apply this. So you had to figure out how to apply it. And then, like I said, I end up almost 260 pounds as a natural, and
no internet.
Yeah.
And then you have the people who have constant, you get stupid questions on your Instagram all the time. It's because those people, how many of those people actually, like, the too long didn't read? They didn't actually go through your entire article.
And Instagram has limited characters. So the fact they weren't willing to put in a minute and a half of reading a caption that could help them a lot tells me a lot about the age we're living in right now.
Yeah. And, don't get me wrong. I've been guilty of, kind of just skimming through things in my life when it comes to, articles and posts and stuff like that. But now it's just, you just want to dive right in and actually learn.
Yeah. I mean, it's an everyday thing, and that's why, like, I've been doing this so long, I can actually generally sit back and as I'm on my phone, I can, or I'm typing it in, I'll be like, here's going to be the different questions that have come in about this. I can usually, and I'll be like, did you read the caption? It's an everyday thing.
It was kind of funny too when I first stumbled on your stuff. It's like, dude, this guy's like hardcore. He's kind of an asshole. not because I wasn't used to that delivery. And then I was like, no, man, he's just real and he has to deal with this shit every day.
Dude, every day, all day long. A lot of people be like, will tell me, I'll get stuff and somebody be like, I lost respect for you because the way you responded. I'm like, dude, there's like, I will literally not even care. Like
No, but
7 seconds. Like, I'm supposed to care about your respect for me. John Meadows tells me all the time that I'm a modern day stoic because I don't give two shits about what somebody else's opinion like that is.
Mhm.
The other thing is that my delivery and writing online, as you and I sit here, we laugh and stuff like that. There's usually people they'll have like, oh, you're not really writing like an asshole. It's actually more in a humorous, fun way, but they read it that way.
Yeah, when you're talking, you have facial expression. You can kind of read the
you have
energy.
context with like the energy. So it's like when I'm writing online, I'm still writing the way that you and I are talking right now, but people read it. And I've just given up on trying to convince people, dude, I'm really not being. Somebody be like, you don't have to fly off the handle. I'm like, well, you don't have to be such a little pussy about it.
Everything is so soft nowadays that anybody just got a firm.
Grow up in that time. I had a 22-year military father, and all the friends I grew up with we all were fighters. We fought, but we loved and cared about each other, deeply. But I just don't have friends that are soft like that. So like online now, the other thing people do is they have this expectation because you're a quote unquote educator that they're entitled to certain information from you and stuff. I literally had a dude send me a video today and said, like, do a form check on my RDL. I'm like, dude, that's what I do for clients. Like this degree of entitlement. They're like, oh, I'm going to get somebody be like, well, you don't owe him, but he just want. I'm like, no, I don't want to help you. I don't, because I literally help thousands of people in my groups and my clients all day long, and they pay me for that. So no, I don't want to. I don't want to do your form check.
You would not ask a plumber to come check out your pipes.
Like, hey, bro, come over check out my toilets, dude, and tell me what's up.
Man.
Like, yeah, that happens all the time. People they don't respect your time or your energy or your knowledge. They just think it's free.
Yeah, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. There's a few more things I wanted to get into in regards to training. In regards to intensity, gauging intensity, personal anecdote here. I was training in a certain way where I felt like I was close to failure. And then I read some of your stuff. I was watching some John Meadows, and he was talking about leg day and just people who with big legs, they know how to push through pain. And I just went into the gym one day and I was very driven, and I'm like, I'm going to push myself. I might push myself too hard. And I did 3 sets of leg press as hard as I could.
That was all you could do, right?
Dude, I did 3 sets of leg press and I was done. I tried to do some walking lunges after. Like, I wanted to puke. I was shaky.
Bro,
worst DOMs of my life.
There's always another gear.
Oh, dude.
Or if you hear,
I was humbled.
If you haven't spent years tapping into real failure, there's a gear there for most people don't realize they have inside of them until they get into that space and they're like, I'm going to find out what I'm really made of here. Mm-hmm. And I really think that's where your greatest gains come from. So the reason why I was 200, almost 260 pounds as natural is because that was what I really wanted to know early on and wanted to find out was how hard can I really train? And that's why I grew. When like the first year I started, I was 98 pounds. That was 14 years old. By the time I was 18, I was 220. So that was the same thing, power shoveling food and training hard. But I think that you can either train and do a bunch of volume and say you think you're 2 RIRs and bullshit like that. More often than not, when guys that have never trained,
I was 6 to 8 away from failure.
When you understand the effective reps method, that the only reps that cause mechanical transduction, which kicks off the whole growth stimulus process,
mechanical tension, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, so you have to have there's a mechanical stimulus that kicks off a physiological process, right? So the only reps that do that are the ones that have enough tension in them so that the fibers detect that there's tension, And then they kicked off mechanotransduction, which is a physiological process, which kicks off mTOR, which kicks off whatever P670K, and then kicks off muscle protein synthesis and all that kind of stuff. So a lot of guys don't realize that unless you get in really going to failure, you don't accumulate enough effective repetitions to accumulate enough mechanical tension to grow.
So that's where the whole volume versus mechanical tension debate is. You can do a ton of volume, but if you're never pushing it to the point where you're getting significant tension, you know,
it doesn't matter. They saw that in the Han study. I always reference that one. It's one of my favorites. So they were doing up to, I can't remember, it was like something like 37 squats in a week.
Sorry, I think I lost you there for a moment.
Okay.
What did I ask? I forgot where we were. Oh, it was the mechanical tension versus volume.
Yeah, the Han studies where they basically saw almost no muscle growth, despite the fact they were doing it was like inordinate amount of volume. So because they were training so far away from failure. So you had to train close enough to failure to accumulate that mechanical tension in a high enough amount that your body has a reason to grow.
Yeah, absolutely. So that brings it back to the whole frequency thing. You should only need one time a week if you're taking it to that point.
And I mean, you could train a muscle twice a week, but I think then what happens is you just reduce your volume. So some of it comes back to personal preference. If you like training a muscle twice a week, you know, as long as you can recover from the training that you're doing, you'll see results. So just manipulate. Here's what I think is more important for people to focus on. Focus on the high degree of effort, focus on progressive overload, and then you manipulate your frequency and volume based on those two factors being met.
Absolutely, man. Awesome. Well, I think we talked a lot about training today. Just a few, how much time do you have? Do you have a little bit more time?
No, like I have like a couple more minutes.
Couple more minutes. Let's just get into this real quick. So the page that I've started is tailored to men and men's issues, masculinity, and I wanted to pick your brain a little bit. So let's ask you a few more questions. What do you consider to be the characteristics of a high value man?
So the characteristics of to me, a high value man would be honor, integrity, courage, competency, and strength. I think that it would be kind of difficult to go wrong with looking at that, no matter what culture you look across. When you look at those various attributes in a man, I think you would see what you would consider a high value man is a man that lives through basically his life through honesty, that he has a high degree of courage, strength, that he does well for himself. One of the things I usually say, because I think from a man's perspective, trying to find that helpmate in life, that, you'd say that person you want to share your life with, is that you actually have to create a life first that's worth inviting another person into to share with you.
Pursue your purpose first.
Yeah. And so I think as long as you're ascribing to I have a friend that has a saying that says, try to make choices during the day that when you lay your head down on the pillow at night, you can sleep easy. And I think if you're living your life as a high value male, as a man, I think you can go to bed at night. Doesn't mean always, because some decisions are harder than others. Yeah. But if you're living a life of honesty, of honor, of courage, making the right choices, even if they're hard, when you lay down at night, you can sleep easy, because basically a mind free of worry is a restful mind, and a mind free of stress is a restful mind. And I think when you're not making decisions that line up with integrity and honesty and honor and all those kind of things, I think it's harder to lay down at night, or it should be if you have a conscience. It's hard to lay down at night and close your eyes and go to sleep and feel at peace with yourself and the world.
Absolutely, man. Well, I think you've answered both my questions there that I was going to ask. So I really appreciate it.
I try to be highly efficient.
No, it's awesome, man. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. You're a busy guy. You're doing a lot of stuff. And I just really appreciate it. Thank you for coming on.
Absolutely, man. I thanks for having me on. It's a good discussion. Have me back when we have some more time.
Absolutely, dude. You have a great rest of your evening.
Thanks, bud. I appreciate you.